All right, Boker Tov, everybody. Good morning. It's so nice to see you on this Erev New Year's Eve. I'm always impressed with the crowd that shows up so early to talk about the highlights of the week of Daf Yomi. And I promise you, once again, like I do many weeks, that I will not able to give you any insight into all. I will not be able to give you insight into all of the highlights because there are so many, but I will do my best to focus on a few, and we'll be able to engage a little bit through the chat and maybe through a few questions about the text that I picked for us to look at this week. So at my house, we're gearing up for the new year and for winter and preparing for the weather starting to change. And if there will be snow, it's coming in the next couple months. And as it happens, my youngest daughter's bat mitzvah is about a month away. So we're in the midst of trying to figure out how do you plan a simcha when COVID changes every week. That's not a highlight of this week's Gemara. Because we're in the middle of Masechet Megillah, and it feels like Purim when I'm studying Daf Yomi. I picked for us today two very different texts. So there'll sort of be a part A and a part B that represent major conversations the Gemara is having this week. And while they're very different, I hope at the end that we can find a connection between the two of them. And welcome everybody. I see we've got East Coast, West Coast, and North America and Europe, people saying hello from all over. So it's so good to have you here. So the Megillah as a book of the Bible, I find to be one of the most unique and one of the most interesting. It's one of the most crafted pieces of literature, meaning from beginning to end, it looks like one story with a lot of authorial intent. And of course, the themes of Purim are about all the reversals, right? A young Jewish girl becomes queen. Mordechai, right, moves from being outside to being the right-hand advisor to the king. Haman goes the other direction, from success to shame when he gets hanged at the end. There's all those tensions from one side, right, lots of flips from one thing to the other, and that motif of reversals is throughout the book. And we're going to zoom in on a particular verse from the middle of the story and a rabbinic midrash about that. I'm just going to share my screen right now. The computer's been acting up a little bit today. Oh, look at this. It is working. Here goes the slideshow. And here is the verse. Right, we know it's chapter 6, so it's in the middle of the story, but in the story we usually tell, it's closer to the beginning, right? The king wakes up in the middle of the night, has a dream. He can't sleep. So he gets his advisors to come and read to him from the journals, and he finds an incident where Mordechai saved him from a plot that sought to assassinate the king. And he brings in his advisor Haman and says, what should we do to a person who saves the king? And right, of course, the story goes, Haman says, oh, you put him on a horse and you carry him through town, and someone walks in front saying, thus shall it be done to the man who the king delights to honor. And of course, Haman thinks that it's going to be him who's going to be walking through town. But it turns out the king honors Mordechai, and the king thinks that Haman's idea is so great, he becomes the person to lead Mordechai through the town. And this in the story makes it worse in the long term for the Jewish people, because Haman, who thought the honor would go to him, of course the honor goes instead to his enemy or the people whom he already hates, and it just increases his rage and increases his desire to do something to get revenge towards the Jewish people. And the rabbis pick up on this theme, and we're going to take a look at a midrash that they bring. So here's the first half of the midrash. It says the following. It starts with our verse, right? And he proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done to the man who the king delights to honor. Haman is leading Mordechai through town, and like the verse says, he's making the announcement that he in fact suggested. Right? And the rabbis bring the following midrash to add to this story. As Haman was taking Mordechai along the street of Haman's house, Haman's daughter was standing on the roof and saw the spectacle. All right, so he's marching through the city, and not only does he just go through the central town square, he must go through all the neighborhoods. Maybe Haman lived in the central town square as an advisor to the king. Maybe he had a fancy house, a fancy place. But the parade of Mordechai, led by Haman, passes Haman's house, and his daughter is standing on the roof and saw the parade go by. And she thinks to herself that the one who is riding on the horse must be his father, and the one walking before him must be Mordechai. So like father, like daughter, like father, like daughter, Haman thought when the king wanted to honor someone, he thought that it would be him. His daughter thinks the same. Maybe Haman tipped her off, but she too thinks Haman is on the horse and Mordechai is walking in front. I guess because she's on the roof and they're walking on the street and everyone's in costume and walking. She can't tell from how far away she is that there's actually a reversal, that it's Haman leading Mordechai and not Mordechai leading Haman. What does she choose to do? Well, again, like father, like daughter. She then took a chamber pot and cast its contents onto the head of her father. The rabbi says, oh, what does she do? I'm going to make it worse for this Mordechai guy walking in front of my father. I'm going to take the chamber pot, right, out of my room and dump it off the roof, and it will land on Mordechai. And won't that make this even better for my father? But of course, since there was a reversal in the roles, the contents of the chamber pot hit not her father. Not Mordechai, but Haman. And the rabbis say in this midrash, when Haman raised his eyes in disgust, she saw that he was her father. And this is one of those points where it could have been, the midrash ended here. Sometimes I feel like the rabbis go one more step, and the question will be, is this one step too far? The midrash says she fell from the roof to the ground and died. That's midrash number one. I'm going to come off of share screen for a minute. Stop the share. Here we go. Maybe you'll see me larger then. So I find a lot of things interesting about this midrash, right? If you've been following in Daf Yomi this week, you'll see a lot of Masechet Megillah is midrashim about Megillat Esther. Right? We have midrash throughout the Talmud, but this is one of the most intense section of midrash about a single biblical book, where often if you want to read midrash like this, you would go to one of the collections of midrashim that go verse by verse and bring rabbinic midrash. This is one of the rare instances where so many pages of Talmud are midrash of this sort. And this in some ways is a typical midrash, because here we see the rabbis jumping into the themes of the Megillah and maybe, kicking it up a notch. It's not just that Haman is humiliated by having to walk Mordechai through the town and declare how Mordechai is being honored by the king when he himself thought he would get that honor, but his own daughter has to witness this, and she is confused about who is whom and ends up throwing the contents of the chamber pot on his head. And not only that, when she sees how embarrassed her father is by this moment, she slips and falls off the roof and dies. Right? It's an exponential growth, maybe in the how this is not a good day for Haman. And as I said, in some ways for me, wish the midrash had stopped a verse earlier. A line earlier, in that it's this piece of where I think maybe the rabbis are taking it a step too far. But that's where I see the insight into what the rabbis are doing with this text, and maybe a little bit of insight into the rabbis. And we've seen this a lot in the midrashim here. The book of Esther shows this reversal. The Jews who are not people of status become people of status. The people of status who are out to get the Jews end up being not people of status. And the rabbis pick up this theme. And there's a way that I think there's a certain rejoicing. But the rabbis of the community in Eretz Yisrael lived in the Talmudic times under Roman in the Mishnah times, especially in early Talmudic times, under Roman rules and also other oppressive foreign powers. They didn't feel like they had a lot of power or a lot of freedom or place in the court. And while the rabbis in Babylonia, we believe, had a much more comfortable life under the Persians than the rabbis in Eretz Israel had under the Romans, they were still not in charge, and they were subject to the mercies of the ruling powers. And the book of Esther tells the story of this diaspora people who can rise up and become part of the court, part of the king's court, into a place of leadership and honor. And the rabbis jump on those themes in the midrashim they tell, and many of the midrashim that we have read try to make this the story even sharper, right? They build on both how evil Haman and his family were. They build on how much Haman is disgraced and the suffering that takes place as a result of the events of the Megillah. And in some ways, it magnifies the strength and importance of the victory that happens at the end of Purim. And here we see it's not just that Haman had to lead Mordechai on this parade, but he was embarrassed before his own daughter. He gets, the remains from the toilet thrown on his head and suffers the loss of a child. And I think the tone of these midrashim, right, this is a victory for the rabbis because this is something that is good for an enemy of Israel to be defeated this way. And I see that in the text, but I also at the same time take pause to say, do they have to go so far? Is there a point at which even the evil Haman, that there's too much that he should suffer? Or his daughter, who was, depending on how you're right, the daughter is not a character really in the Megillah. She's a character in the Midrash. We don't know if she was 6 or 12 or 37, right? And how you read the Midrash might be different depending on what age you put on the daughter, but maybe this is a little too much, the death of the daughter here. But it does, and for me, it adds to some of the questions I have about Purim and the Megillah itself, really, where that strikes me that we often tell the children's version of the Purim story on Megillah and not the full story, not the full story of the Megillah, because right, the Megillah itself says, right, after there's the big reversal in the Megillah where Haman is defeated and Mordechai is put into court and the Jews are saved from their fate of being destroyed, the last few chapters, which don't always make it into our school curriculum, and by the end of the Megillah, we might not be paying attention so much. Right, there's the proclamation of the king that said the Jews, that the people can rise up and kill the Jews, can't be rescinded because an edict of the king can't be rescinded. And in response to Haman being defeated, Achashverosh issues a new decree allowing the Jews to defend themselves. Right? The last chapters of the Megillah are where the people come to kill the Jews rise up and defeat their enemies. There's a massacre that's perpetrated by the Jews at the end of the Megillah that, just like I find sometimes that this Midrash might be one step too far, I think sometimes maybe the Megillah might be one step too far. But that in part is one of the themes of this book of Esther and the theme of Purim, and we see the rabbis jump onto that in this Midrash here. I hope you're following in the chat. There's some rich comments from people about the story and exploring these different ideas. Questions about the daughter. There's one, I like this one question, right? The Midrash explains, right, why a girl's on the roof filled with a chamber pot, right? It might be the chamber pot was kept on the roof. It might be, roofs in that time weren't like our roofs. People hung out on their roofs a little more. Maybe the chamber pot was up there. And it's feasible if you've ever been to parts of the world where chamber pots are spilled out into the street. In certain neighborhoods, right, they might be tossed out a window or from the roof. So she might have just been cleaning house a little bit. All right, so that was part one, text number one. And it comes from the first pages of the week, which are embedded in a whole series of midrashim. Text number two comes from the next chapter, which starts a whole new discussion. The Midrashim are put aside for a little bit, and there's some questions about how do we read the Megillah. And I'm going to pull up this text as well. I'm going to share my screen again. Oh, here we go. I found it. All right. The Mishnah says, "Kra'ah serugim yatsa." If you read the Megillah in serugin, I'm intentionally not translating that word just yet. You've fulfilled your obligation. And I bring here the translation and commentary from Steinsaltz, which also is on Sefaria. If one reads, there's an S missing. Sorry, if one reads the Megillah, serugin, which Steinsaltz tells us means at intervals, and he also tells us pausing and resuming, one has fulfilled his obligation. So what does this mean if we're reading the Megillah and we do it in intervals, meaning we read a little bit and then we stop and take a break and we go back and we read more and then we stop and then we go back and we read more. That's an acceptable way to read the Megillah. And in fact, in many of our congregations, that's what we do. We read a chapter, and between chapters, there might be a skit or a song or all kinds of Purim festivities. Different synagogues have their own traditions. And what the Mishnah teaches us here, which in fact is what we do, is we can read, we can pause, stop and restart the reading of the Megillah, and that's okay. We don't have to open up the Megillah, start from verse 1 and read all the way to the end without interruption. Interruptions are okay. That comes from the Mishnah. And the reason why I left Serugim in italics here and brought you the Steinsaltz read and didn't explain it at first is because on the very next page in the Gemara tells us the sages did not know what is meant by the word Serugim. Here's a word in the Mishnah, Serugim, and the Gemara tells us the rabbis aren't sure what this word means. I love that. Right? It's true. The Mishnah uses all kinds of terms from all different, a lot of Hebrew, but there are Greek words in the Mishnah. There are other words in the Mishnah, and it's feasible that generations later the sages didn't know what the words mean. Now, the commentators differ about whether they just didn't know what Serugin meant at all, or whether they knew that Serugin meant some kind of interval, some kind of pause. They just didn't know how large that pause was to be a Serugin interval. But here's how they discovered what the word means. I love this story. One day, they heard the maidservant in Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's house saying to the sages who were entering the house intermittently, rather in a single group, "How long are you going to enter? Serugin, Serugin." Then they figured out what it meant. So if you have kids at home, or you had kids at home once, this might relate, right? You know, you're in the kitchen cooking, or you're trying to read the newspaper or something, and the kids are playing in the backyard, and they keep running back in and out of the house for, a drink, the bathroom, to ask a question. And instead of coming in all at once, they come in one at a time over the course of, a half hour playing in the backyard, right? The back door keeps slamming and it interrupts you. It's hard for you to cook or read the paper or whatever you're doing. And so what do you say? Like, can't you guys stop coming in and out of the house through that back door? That's how I hear the maidservant in Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's house, right? The rabbis are gathering at Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's house. We have many stories that we've read over the years of Daf Yomi, and we'll have more about the sages in Rabbi Nasi's house coming to do their business. But the maidservant just wants them to enter at the same time, right? Stop slamming the door. Stop entering Serugin, Serugin. And somehow by that, they hear a use of the word outside of the Mishnah in everyday speech. And what comes of that? Well, that's how they understand the halacha of the Mishnah. You are allowed to read the Megillah Serugin, Serugin, meaning intermittently with some sort of intervals, right at that pace where, people are coming to a meeting and they don't all enter at once, but someone else comes in every couple of minutes. Or if you like my image of the kids coming in from the backyard and the slamming of the door, that's what this speaks to me a little bit. So this text, I think, gives us some different insight to the rabbis. Here we see, besides that it's in the middle of a legal passage, we see the rabbis and the Gemara are willing to admit they don't know it all. or they didn't know at all, to say, here's a word from the Mishnah, right? There's no more experts of the Mishnah than the rabbis of the Gemara. That's what they do. The rabbis of the Gemara are Mishnah experts. So for them to say, we don't know what one of the words means, I think that's powerful. And the fact that, and we know, and the fact that they learn what the word means from a maidservant in the household says they're open to learn from all kinds of places, right? And embedded in the story are some things about, right, class, right? The rabbis in this story, they put themselves in, I think some of it is they're learning from a maidservant and not one of the scholars. There's probably something about gender here too. But there are lots of stories where the rabbis see where sometimes it's, if a woman shows up in a rabbinic story, often she has the smartest thing to say. Sometimes where the women show up in Jewish law, it's not always the best position for them to be in. And a few years down the road, we'll have a lot of time to discuss the rabbis in Jewish law and women when we get to Seder Nashim. And we'll deal with some other things, at least the egalitarian world that I live in, some of the difficult passages to read the rabbis. But here we see, we don't know what the Mishnah means. We're going to learn from this moment in the household when the rabbis are coming into this meeting and they just can't bother to come in at the same time. In the intervals at which they answer, to the annoyance of the maidservant, who might, maybe she's trying to mop the floor in the front room and keep it clean, and they keep tracking in mud. That's where we learn. That's where we learn what the Mishnah is about, and then apply that to the laws for the reading of the Megillah. So that's text B, right? As I said at the beginning, right? Part 2 from a very different kind of discussion and a different place from part 1. We had some midrash, and here we have a halachic text with a story. But I think this also, if I'm going to tie them together, I think both these texts give us some insight to the rabbis and who they were and how they thought. We see in their interpretation of the story of Esther, their desire to express maybe the hardship that they feel about the place they have in the worlds in which they live. And they jump at the opportunity of the theme of Purim to imagine both Haman's defeat and Mordechai's victory, and also their own. I'm reading them into the story because I think they would like to see themselves become the Mordechais of their day. And then at the same time here we see some insight where they have a sense of humor about themselves and some humility about themselves to say, we don't know everything in the Mishnah. We can't always explain exactly what it means, and sometimes we just don't know. And we're willing to learn from all sorts of places about it. And we see it's a different expression, it's a different voice. But we also see a little bit about who they are because they bring that humility to it. And I think while there's definitely some grief in that first story with the death of Haman's daughter, I think there's a little sense of humor in both of these stories in their own way. And those faces that I've seen on my Zoom screen, I've seen some smiles and parts as we've seen the text. So I've seen a few people who are expressing also the humility in the story. So thanks for that. I want to pause. We have about 4 or 5 minutes to go. We try to open some things up for comments. I see lots of things already emerging in the text. I'm going to jump into what I saw Janine say. There is a section that we read this week that is confusing about what language we can read the Megillah in. And Janine, I agree with you. It's a confusing passage. And if you're a little confused by it, you're not alone in reading it, and being confused by it. I actually had to go back and read it a couple times myself because there were some confusions. But if you know, for Torah reading, especially, the rabbis instituted that a verse of Torah was read, and then a translator the Torah reader would pause, and the translator would translate the verse of the Torah into Aramaic, which was the language spoken by the people. So, we today have print books with we don't need to translate the Torah reading because we can follow along in the translation in our Chumashim that, fortunately, I think almost all of our synagogues are fortunate to be able to have that did away with a synagogue job. But the question comes up here from Masechet Megillah, Do you have to read it in the original language, or can you also read it in translation? And some of the conversation is about, do you need to read it using like Hebrew font, right? Katav Ashurit, when the rabbis say that, is about what font the Megillah is written in. Meaning, do you have to read it from an authentic Hebrew font, or if you read it in transliteration, is that okay? And the rabbis say you have to read it in an authentic font. But then there's some confusion in the Mishnah where it says you can't read it in other languages. But then it says if you read it in other languages that you understand, that's okay. And for me, that was the point of confusion. I had to dig down a little bit. And then the Mishnah says a few things, and the Gemara goes into that as well. The rabbis, to the best of my understanding, settle on the fact that if you understand a different language, you can read the Megillah in that different language. There are some limits that they place upon that. But Janine, you're right to be confused by that section. I would say the commentary on Sefaria that comes with the English translation, which is Adin Steinsaltz's English translation, is a great place to go to try to clarify it. And maybe that will do more justice than I tried to do in these couple of minutes. All right, I see a couple hands raised. So let's see. Carol, you want to unmute and ask your question? Ben, if she can't unmute herself, if you can help out and unmute her, that would be great.
Go ahead, Carol.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rabbi, for your insights into the way the rabbis have put this together. And I have a question about the first point you made. When you were talking about the addition of what happens to Haman's daughter, were you getting at the idea that we shouldn't rejoice in the downfall of our enemies? And if so, don't the rabbis kind of preempt that insider criticism at the beginning of the Masachet when Esther herself is advocating for the inclusion of this Megillah in the Tanakh? And the rabbis say, well, it has so much in it that would give people who aren't Jewish a reason to hate us. We better not put it in. And she says, well, it's already in the secular histories. Do they kind of try to cover that by having that debate then? That's my question. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Carol. I think that's great. Well, you're right that the Talmud especially isn't univocal, meaning, right, it often has a whole range of opinions upon the same topic. Right, and there are places where in the Gemara and in Midrash where the rabbis rejoice at the defeat of Haman and the defeat of our enemies. And there are times when we try to, you said it very well, right? We shouldn't overly rejoice at the downfall of our enemies, right? I don't know if this is something that you know, but on Passover, after the first 2 days of the holidays, we say the shortened version of Hallel in the morning. Hallel is a service that enters into the morning prayers that are psalms of praise that we say on happy occasions. And on Passover, for the last days of Passover, after the first 2 days, or just the first day in Israel, we don't say the full Hallel. We limit our joy. Why? The rabbis say, because we feel some sadness about the defeat of the Egyptians and the drowning of all the soldiers in the Red Sea, so we limit our joy. Right, and there's even a midrash where God says, right, my creations have drowned. How can you sing in praise? Where God asks us to do that as well. Some say there, right, the soldiers weren't. Pharaoh was the evil character, and the soldiers were maybe innocent victims of Pharaoh's stubbornness. But it does touch on what you said, Carol, and I think you're right that sometimes the rabbis aren't comfortable with it. But we also see a lot in the Midrashim. We saw in this Masachet and Midrashim about the book of Esther in general. There's a lot of rejoicing over the downfall of Haman, and there's a lot of rejoicing over the downfall of our enemies that comes from that. Right? There were all the passages that because we were talking about Haman, we would talk about Nebuchadnezzar and other enemies of the Jewish people in the biblical text. And I think it becomes an ongoing question. And we've had many opportunities throughout history as a people where we've had enemies who seek to defeat us. We as a people have had resilience and luck and survived that history that we've had. And there is a question, how do we deal with the downfall of our enemies and what are the limits on it? And you pointed to that really well, Carol. And I think I want to leave the question open in that. I think it's a question we have to struggle with. How much rejoicing at the downfall of our enemies is too much? All right, Rob, let's say we're a little over on minutes, but Rob's hand is up. Why don't we take one more question? Oh, he took the question away. His hand went down. All right, well, we started on time, and I think it's important to end on time. It was great to see everybody today. It's great to learn with you, and I really appreciate your comments that you added to the text. I want to wish you a happy new year until we see you the next time. I'm going to turn things back over to Ben.